Association. Welcome to our public meeting, and we are glad to have you with us so that we can talk about the Resilient Neponset Flood Modeling Project and about our climate collaborative that is part of that important project. Welcome. So we will go through kind of a recap of our project and have many of the project partners a part of the conversation. And before we get started, I wanted to start with a land acknowledgement. And then we'll go back to the norms, if you would, Carrie. But we acknowledge and honor the Indigenous communities who have nurtured the land and waters of the Neponset River watershed for at least 10,000 years. To our knowledge, the Neponset watershed includes portions of the traditional lands of the Massachusetts, Nipmuc, Pokanoket, and Wampanoag tribes. For our use and enjoyment of this area today, we are connected with Indigenous stewardship of the land for many centuries and the history of forced separation from their traditional homeland through colonization. As you explore the watershed, we encourage you to join us in actively learning about its past and current Indigenous heritage. Thank you. As we set upon our meeting tonight, we ask you to observe our public meeting norms, that one, be respectful of others and our time together to discuss important topics. Number two, disruptive behavior is not welcome in this forum. And third, while there may be wide-ranging opinions about climate science in our world today, our agenda tonight is about making our communities more resilient to worsening storms and climate change, and not to have a debate about whether climate change is real or not. We appreciate everyone respecting our focus here tonight. And with that, I'd like to acknowledge quickly our project team, the Neponset River Watershed, Weston and Sampson Engineering, MAPC, Metropolitan Area Planning Council, and our project partners with Town of Dedham leading the way as our fiscal agent, and all the other cities and towns that are part of our watershed. We are grateful to all for partnership and collaboration. And with that, I will pass it to Carrie Schneider, our Managing Director for Community Resilience at NEPRA.
Thank you, Karen. So just to make sure that we are all starting in the same context, I just wanted to talk a little bit about what climate impacts we're talking about and what their consequences might be. And then we'll, as the program continues, we'll get into some of the things we can do to prepare. So climate impacts. What is climate change? It's the actual warming up of the planet. And while that sounds pretty specific, it actually has very varying impacts in different regions. In our region, we see its most intense impacts at the extremes. We'll still have variable temperatures and seasons, but we're already experiencing certain noticeable changes. For example, we're seeing changes in precipitation patterns. We're seeing more of our rain come down as heavy downpours, concentrated at certain times of the year. We're seeing more frequent heat waves or days over 90 degrees Fahrenheit. We're seeing more severe windstorms, and we're seeing sea level rise. And all of these have impacts for humans and infrastructure. As we get into this, I want to make sure that as we're talking about this, everybody understands that not everyone is affected the same way by climate change and its impacts. If we take heat, for example, local temperatures are going to be higher in a built environment, a more urban environment with more impervious or paved surfaces, than it will be in a leafy neighborhood. In addition, certain people are more vulnerable to those impacts, whether it's because they have fewer resources and can't get out of the way when there's a big storm coming, whether they're people of color, youth are more affected, seniors, those with disabilities and those of lower income. So as we think about these impacts, we want to make sure that we're centering equity and making sure that we're paying attention to those disproportionate impacts. So what are the consequences of climate change? Well, we've got public health impacts. Um, More heat waves means lower air quality, particularly in built environments like urban and suburban neighborhoods, which makes up most of our watershed. Um, we might see schools closing because they lack air conditioning. We might see loss of work days due to illness. Um, and, think about those heat waves being exacerbated by power outages because the grid is being overtaxed. So, these things have consequences. There are also public safety and property damage impacts. So heat waves, windstorms, flooding, and drought increase risks for wildfires. They might interfere with emergency services and first responder responsibilities. They can stress water supplies and damage homes. We might also see infrastructure damage. So changes in precipitation patterns lead to more flooding, but also more drought. So we could see stress to infrastructure like roads, bridges, dams, culverts. Um, our infrastructure generally wasn't built to withstand the increased precipitation that we're seeing today. And many of them are in disrepair. We see ecological consequences. Sewer overflows can lead to contamination of drinking water sources or recreational areas. Changing seasons, might elongate the vector season. So, like mosquitoes might live longer. We might see them in more than just the summer. Um, and a reduction in physical habitat and habitat quality for fish and wildlife might result from some of these impacts. So we're really talking about wide-ranging issues. But that's the bad news. We want to talk about what we might be able to do, and since we're already experiencing changes, how can we adapt to those and make sure that our communities are safer and healthier? So first, why did we want to do a regional project in the first place? Well, we wanted to do this on a watershed-wide basis because it helps us to more holistically evaluate the risks and benefits of interventions in the future. A watershed is an area of land that drains to the same water body. In this case, it's the Neponset River. And water doesn't respect town boundaries. Um, so, we want to make sure that we're looking at the watershed as a whole, even though certain towns have done their own flood modeling. This watershed-wide model shows us where the water is coming when it's coming from outside of the town boundaries and where it's going once it leaves a particular town. What happens upstream will affect what is experienced downstream. So we really want to make sure that we're taking a holistic approach. So what did we do? What have we been doing? So we've been able to facilitate most of the towns within the Neponset River watershed to do several things. We've created a watershed-wide flood model. We've enhanced that model over time as we get new information. We've created concept designs for interventions that might reduce flooding and help us store water in big storms. We have been talking with towns about collaborating and prioritizing shared projects that will not just benefit local communities, but will also benefit the watershed as a whole. We've also been talking to residents. We were able to recruit several members to a community advisory group, and you'll hear more about all of these later. We've also been getting out into the community to do public education. We've been at your farmers markets and Norwood Day and Walpole Day, trying to make sure that you know the great work that your towns are doing. And the last piece of context setting I'd like to say is, what this project is focused on is climate resilience. And what do we mean by that? We mean we want to make sure that our communities are positioned best to bounce back or bounce forward when extreme weather hits. And this requires that we acknowledge that there are existing climate changes that are already here, and we need to adapt to that. Climate mitigation is the reduction of greenhouse gases to reduce the severity of climate change. And that is really important too. But we need to be doing both of these things together. Limit the severity of climate change as best we can, but also adapt to those changes that are already in motion. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to our technical team to talk to you about the great work that we've been doing in our flood modeling.
Thanks, Carrie. I think we'll start first with about the resilient Neponset Climate Collaborative, and then we'll get into the exciting technical work right soon after. Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining. So now I will share a little bit more updates about the Resilient Neponset Climate Collaborative that has been hard at work over the past couple of years during this grant project phase. Next slide, please. All right, so what is the collaborative? The collaborative comprises of a group of municipalities in the Neponset River watershed working together through best practices and shared experiences to strengthen the region's climate resilience efforts. So as Carrie said earlier, there's things are happening with extreme weather, flooding, extreme heat, where all communities are experiencing that. And so since 2022, the collaborative serve as sort of a convening space for municipal staff, community members to come together to think about coordinating planning and implementation solutions to prepare all communities in the watershed and protect them from the anticipated climate change impacts that we just talked about. So the vision and framework for the collaborative, there are four main components. One is to foster partnerships and collaborations to advance climate resilience planning and implementation efforts in the watershed. Determining collective goals and priority actions, short and long term, to be implemented across communities, particularly through the lens of equity to ensure just outcomes for those disproportionately impacted by climate change in the region. And then identify and pursue technical assistance and funding opportunities to support watershed scale climate resilience projects, as well as local resilience projects with regional benefits. And of course, supporting implementation of projects throughout the region to advance climate adaptation. In putting together this vision, along with the steering committee comprised of municipal staff of the collaborative, we want to acknowledge that we know there are communities are already hard at work. We're not starting from ground zero by any means. Communities are at different places, at different pace in terms of how they're planning for and implementing their climate actions, but in forming this collaborative and pulling together sort of the regional scale priority actions, we're hoping to amplify the outcomes, how we're all preparing for climate resilience together. Next slide, please. So just a snapshot here of the timeline. As I mentioned, sort of we've started, this is already in phase 2. In phase 1, we talked about the framework, establishing the vision, going through sort of all of the different priorities for each of the communities together in order to sort of come up with the list of watershed scale regional priorities. And then in phase 2, which is since 2024, we have formed and convened several key meetings throughout to gather feedback in terms of what the municipal staff and community members want to see the collaborative looking like, what would they like to do, and in that we're establishing or developing a work plan to outline sort of what are some of these priorities and how to implement them in the next 3 to 5 years. So what does this collaborative work plan will look like? How should the strategies be organized? Getting feedback on the categories of the priority actions, which we'll show you in a little bit more. And kind of start putting the content together. Throughout that, we also provide technical assistant workshops to dive deeper into some of the topics that communities want to hear more. For example, green infrastructure, sort of stormwater management, bylaw, regulatory language reviews, how to integrate climate change information and action into those regulatory language. And of course, since April, we have been hard at work finalizing the collaborative work plan. So that should be coming out soon, hopefully, with all the feedback that you've all given us. We're integrating into our final work plan then. And so what's in the work plan? So the work plan is divided into 3 key categories. One is an overview of the collaborative, sort of to give you, again, sort of how did it form? What did we do? What are the vision and the framework? And then the key part of the work plan is in section 2, which is the priority implementation actions and roadmaps. This laid out the 9 priority implementation actions. And again, when I say that, these are the regional scale priority actions identified throughout our discussions. And they're organized into 3 strategic focus areas. And so the roadmaps will lay out in detail sort of how to go about achieving and implementing these priority actions. And then, of course, with equity and environmental justice is front and center in this work plan. We want to make sure all of the priorities actions are being developed and implemented through the lens of equity. We also dedicated a section of the work plan to identify outreach and engagement strategies to make sure that all voices are included in part of the planning, decision making, and beyond. All right, so as I mentioned, the 3 strategic focus areas that we agreed along with the steering committee and through the meetings to come up with and how we're organizing these priority actions. So one is infrastructure improvements. And so implementation actions in this focus area explore opportunities to enhance the adaptability of critical built assets and systems, such as roads, bridges, utilities, municipal facilities and buildings. Example of infrastructure include retrofitting and or upgrading existing structures to better withstand more frequent and intense climate hazards, and ensuring that infrastructure design and constructed in the future include the latest projected climate data. And then the second category is natural resources, ecological restoration and open space preservation. That's a mouthful, but there's just a lot and that we wanted to capture in this category. And so implementation actions in this focus area aim to protect and restore vital environmental resources and systems such as wetlands, forests, and river that can naturally provide enhanced climate resilient solutions such as flood control, heat mitigation, carbon sequestration, habitat preservation, and much more. And so it includes the preservation of open space also to maintain biodiversity, enhance ecosystem services. Most importantly, protecting and preserving these critical natural assets will also significantly, will have significant impacts and benefits to public health and social well-being too, given the more access we will have to the natural space. And last but not least is the policy and planning. So implementation actions in this focus area examine the opportunities to develop and implement framework regulatory strategies that strengthen climate and community resilience effort across the watershed region. Again, how did we come up with the 9 priority actions? We did a homework looking at all of the priority actions, all of the planning priorities in each of the communities in the watershed, and then we sort of distill to come up with what we're seeing as the common themes, and what are folks already doing, what are the communities are kind of having the pipeline would like to do, all of that. And then we developed this evaluation criteria to sort of bring the actions into how to prioritize, and to ultimately come up with a list of the top 9 that we will work with the collaborative to implement in the next 3 to 5 years, like I mentioned. It doesn't mean that all the other actions have gone away. They're here. Communities may have already start working on some of the actions that they identify as priorities as well. So it's definitely, again, we're trying to find sort of the synergies here. And so the evaluation criteria are: 1, of course, centering equity, looking at optimizing the co-benefits potential, also the level of implementation efforts for municipal staff, cost to implement, how are these priority actions aligned with local efforts ongoing in the pipeline, for example, and of course, potential for public support and community engagement. It's important to have community buy-in to make sure that this share ownership and in the implementation phase of these actions. All right, so I won't read through all of these, but just want to give you the sort of the information, the details of the priority actions. So here are the 3 that rose to the top as the priority actions for infrastructure improvement. Again, we're seeing assess and upgrading aging municipal infrastructure, analyze future climate threats to the critical infrastructure, facilities, and residential areas, and of course, performing vulnerability studies on some of the key systems and infrastructure like transportation, bridges, and culverts, and especially those that have that regional impact. Priority actions for natural resources, ecological restoration, and open space preservation. There are 2 here. One is creating of pocket parks and implementation of street to park conversion. Again, creating more green space, more space access for folks to be able to cool during extreme heat, protect and promote the preservation and creation of wetlands as well. And then the priority actions for policy and planning. There are 4 here. Minimize impervious surface through revisiting relevant bylaw, zoning, parking requirements, conducting bylaw review across the region for kind of alignment and consistency in terms of how communities can implement climate action through the regulatory updates. Incorporating green infrastructure in new development and redevelopment projects. So again, promoting green infrastructure techniques to optimize that resilience solution. And of course, require low impact development and water conservation techniques in new development and redevelopment to reduce water usage, add connection to the surrounding open space, etc. So again, all of these priority actions you'll see once we publish the work plan, they're all in there that you will be able to kind of look at more closely as well. And for these 9 priority actions, we also develop detailed roadmaps to kind of sort of serve as the recipe for how to do the implementation part. So some of these are the key elements of what we include in these roadmaps and how we'll detail out sort of recommended implementation lead and support who should be implementing, municipal staff, departments and staff, based from kind of the work experience and those with the expertise to lead the implementation efforts. Key implementation next steps. This is where we're laying out sort of the recommendations of how to go about the step to implement the actions. Implementation partners, no one can do this alone. So who, this could be the partner municipalities who have been thinking about this or maybe have started some of this work, but also community-based organizations, folks with the advocacy groups, community members, community leaders, those who have information and or sort of the work in the ground already, or may have ideas to support. Potential co-benefits. So this is in addition to, for example, improving the state of the infrastructure. What are some of the other co-benefits, such as allowing for improvement of water quality, public health access to a certain space, public space or something like that. So we'll wanted to list out as many co-benefits as we can. Also, how is this implementation action would improve the equity? So thinking through sort of what are the current equity issues associated with the problem, and how this will positively provide it or have positive impact and benefits. And of course, most importantly is the potential funding sources. How are we going to fund this priority action? And again, once implemented, how do we know that it has been a success effort? And so we want to list out sort of how we're going to be able to track and monitor beyond the throughout the project lifetime. So the next couple slide, definitely don't want you to read in detail, but just want to give you a snapshot of this is an example of the priority action. One of the priority action, we provided descriptions and then again, including the details based on the implementation details that I was just going through just now. So the next slide will show additional sort of different details that were recommended here or include for the implementation roadmap details there. Right? Okay, as I said, we're finalizing the work plan. It should be published soon on the NEPRA website for you all to see. But we would love to get your input. How can we ensure public participation and support to ensure successful implementation? What resource or assistance does your community needs with engagement efforts to make sure that we get community buy-in and move these projects along smoothly? So with that, I'll turn it back to Karen.
Excellent. Thanks, Van. Did you introduce yourself?
I think I did, but again, my name is Van. I'm Assistant Director of Environmental Planning here at MAPC, a partner of this project. Thank you, Karen.
That's great. That's great. You're such a wonderful resource. I just wanted people to know in what capacity, you share your expertise and knowledge and experience with us. So thanks so much. What a valuable partner and partners we have in this project. And we certainly, it takes us all to get this work done, and the experience that MAPC and Weston and Sampson bring from other areas of the state and other towns and municipalities and watersheds. So all very valuable in the work that we move forward. So yes, are there any questions for Van or anything that's come up thus far? Please feel free to add those in the Q&A option, and we will hope to answer most of those before we leave tonight. But we'll go to seeing no questions at this time, we'll go to the next slide, please. So as I mentioned, I am Karen Gross-Horan, and I'm a Dorchester resident, and I'm the community engagement strategist at Neponset River Watershed. And before working in that capacity at NEPRA, I was a member of the community advisory group that is the Resilient Neponset Community Advisory Group. Our group consists of many watershed towns and municipalities, several community-based organizations, 13 members, 18 members, and We mostly met on Zoom, though we had one in-person hybrid option, and had 7 meetings over the 2-year project. And we'll talk a little bit later about what the next stages of the community advisory group will be. I'll give you a general overview of some of what took place over our years together on this project, and how we brought the community group together to really support the work that we were doing. And if you go to the next slide, I'll talk a little bit about how we came together and what was important for our group to learn. And much of what Carrie introduced early in the presentation, we went into quite a level of depth in our first meeting to just talk about climate change, so that we all were starting from a similar platform, and we all had the knowledge and learning that we needed to move deeper as we try to understand what are the adaptive strategies that this project was going to support and to help us learn more about. So with that, we went to more in-depth meetings with people from the town or from the city of Boston that had expertise in incorporating green infrastructure, and also understanding heat impacts and the strategies that the city of Boston has come up with to combat these climate changes that are upon us now, and how we could start to think about how we move more deeply incorporating some of these strategies into our own watershed projects and our expertise that we work with our community collaborative on. From that, we learned about building a framework for collaborative resilience, and how building community resilience to climate change was really critical to the work that we would be doing. As we move to the next slide, we in polling our collaborative that Van talked about, and in our community advisor group, we understood that we were all on a similar page as far as some of the most serious concerns that we had, and some of the strategies that we could all agree on. So extreme heat and the impacts of flooding were, of course, at the highest levels of concern. I apologize for my dog, the puppy that's moaning in the background. Please excuse them if they are interfering with my sound. But these are the aspects that were really a priority as we polled the members of the community advisor group and the collaborative: more green space, dedicated programming, and clear messaging to direct people during some of the critical extreme heat events, nature-based strategies to reduce local temperatures, keeping cool during heat waves, and improving communications from municipalities ahead of extreme conditions. Next slide, please. As we moved to their second year of learning and growing together, we focused on really how we impact and interact with our communities. And as Van mentioned, the environmental justice communities and those aspects of our project are just so critical to the planning that we're doing. And we're all learning together. So we engaged with MAPC and their great expertise in community engagement and community involved planning. So we learned a lot from them, shared that, of course, with the community members and community representatives, so they could understand how they can work better with bringing some of those voices to the table and incorporating it in the important work that we see coming in the future. We then had an excellent presentation from community members and from Malden about the Malden River Works project, and from Braintree about some of the infrastructure, green and gray infrastructure projects that they have been taking on lately, and learned a lot in kind of taking the more theoretical frameworks and how these organizations are putting them into action. And then our last meeting, where we talked about what is the community collaborative work plan, how do we interact with that, how can we inform that, how can we support that in the towns and municipalities that we live and work in, and then talk about what's next as we move forward to considering the possibility and hope that we will be funded for our next round of municipal vulnerability funding going forward. And what we hope will be an opportunity to engage more deeply with community liaisons and have them more solidly working on projects in their communities that build community resilience and build the learning and understanding of why these topics are so critical to us all. Next slide, please. So as we learned about engaging with our communities, community-driven planning, of course, honors power sharing, mutual respect for experience and expertise, informed decision-making, maximum involvement, and relationship building. And we really put the work in the hands of community, that their lived experience, their expertise, their living and working in community is what's going to inform us and our strategies moving forward. So they really are critical and central to the work that we're doing. And next slide, please. Kind of center this quote. I really love the process by which residents of vulnerable and impacted communities find for themselves the challenges they face, the solutions most relevant to their unique assets and threats. So we all bring experience and expertise, but this is really the core of the work and the importance of centering community in everything that we do. Next slide, please. And then as we worked with Malden River Works, it did an important project that was so community centered and so community oriented. They were an incredible inspiration in describing the work that they've been doing for many years. The project has not yet completely broke ground. I think they've cut ribbon, but it's really incredible and inspirational, the work that they've done and kind of the way they went about it, and how you can see large number of community members coming together to really vision and really set their sights on what they envision and dream for their riverfront. And on to the next slide, please. And then Braintree and some of the incredible work that they are doing to repurpose areas of the town where they can put such as large catchments such as this was part of I think a park that was right adjacent to the river, a river near them, not the Neponset River, but in another watershed. So it was really interesting and critical to hear the way that they went about their work and the successes and challenges that they had. And it really gave us a true sense of what it takes to get some of these large projects done. So that was insightful and helpful for us, the community members that aren't working with us day to day, like the collaboration and the town workers that are the town planners and the town engineers and GIS experts. And with that, next slide. And then our last meeting was really kind of talking about it all, talking about the flood modeling, talking about the collaborative, and talking about the work ahead and in the work plan, and what kinds of things did our community advisory group see as, well, these are things that are a little hard to take in. Maybe you can make this a little bit more accessible by explaining this aspect, because flood modeling is pretty technical, and we want to make it as accessible to our communities and our residents as possible. So insights and things such as that, and then all looking over the work plan, like what makes sense here, what do you have questions about, just so that, again, we can make that as accessible and available to people to observe in a public way. So we have had really great insights and feedback on the different aspects of the project moving as we move forward. Next slide, please. And with that, I'd say, we're, as I mentioned, really hopeful that we have our next opportunity to be deepening our work and continuing what we've already been doing. You'll hear next about the flood modeling and the identified catchments in our watershed that came through some really great next level planning and engineering for what's ahead for the watershed. And with that, I will take any questions that might come up for you so far, or we can pass it on to Weston and Sampson and Jenny Moonen, I believe.
Thank you, Karen.
Oh,
Are
I'm
we
drowning,
pausing
sorry.
for questions before we segue into this? Or we will just take the questions in the chat and for now, and then we will leave enough time to answer questions, I believe is the approach.
I think that sounds good. Yes, I don't see any currently in Q&A, so why don't you take it, Indrani?
All right. Thank you very much, Karen. This section will be co-presented by me and my colleague, Jenny Janet Moonen. I lead the resiliency practice at Weston & Sampson, and Jenny is a senior PM and resiliency engineering lead at Weston & Sampson. As Karen mentioned, in this section, we will take a closer look at the Neponset River flood model that we have been developing as part of this project. And we will discuss how we used the flood model to analyze your needs, the community's needs, and what the communities you all can do to mitigate flooding that we have been hearing throughout this presentation. So this is an interesting graphic which we have presented earlier as part of this project, which essentially shows the increasing flood risk that the Neponset River watershed is likely to experience from extreme rainfall events in the future. These are extreme rainfall projections that have been adopted by the state of Massachusetts based on best available science and data. And that is showing that the 500-year storm of today, which is a fairly infrequent event, an event that has a 0.2% chance of occurring in any given year today, is likely to be a 100-year storm by 2070, or a storm that has a 1% chance of occurring by 2070. A 25-year storm of today is likely to be a 10-year storm by 2050. So really, we see an intensification of extremes and frequencies as we look at the future planning horizons, which implies that that is the additional rain, the additional intensification of heavy rainfall events that this watershed is likely to experience, which is going to affect our communities, our neighborhoods, our critical infrastructure, the roads that we use to travel, and so on. So we developed the Neponset River flood model, the watershed-wide flood model. We started developing this in 2022, and we updated this throughout the duration of this current phase, which we are wrapping up later this month. So I just want to take a moment to talk about what a model is, what a flood model is. A flood model is essentially a hydrologic and hydraulic model that is a representation of in the watershed of what happens when it rains. You know, how much rain results in runoff, what infiltrates to the ground. The model is intended to represent where precipitation goes, how long it hangs out there for in our built and natural environments. And it also is a tool for us to predict what would happen with a variety of rain events in the future, as we talked about. So ultimately, it is a representation of where flooding happens now, where it is expected to occur in the future due to climate change. And we can also use the model to evaluate flood reduction strategies, to evaluate the solutions that we as communities would have to consider to reduce or eliminate the harmful impacts of flooding. So just as a reminder, this model covers over approximately 120 square miles of the watershed. You can see the stats here, approximately 160,000 linear feet of the river. We're modeling several hundreds, thousands of linear of the tributaries to the Neponset. We have discretized the model up into several conduits that shows the drainage infrastructure, the manholes, the catch basins. We've looked at dams in the watershed, and we've analyzed over close to about 400 culverts throughout the watershed. So this graphic is interesting as it shows how much flood volumes. There are two things. This is showing how much additional flooding area are we going to experience across the watershed with these intensification of rainstorms that we just talked about. So between the 10-year storm of today and the 10-year storm of 2070, there may be approximately 1,085 more acres of land that may be flooded during a 10-year storm event, which is likely to drop about 7 inches of rain in 24 hours by 2070. Let's remember that 1 football field is approximately 1 acre. So additional area that we would be seeing flooded by 2070 is approximately 1,085 football fields across the watershed. So now if we consider what that flooding entails in terms of volume, that translates to approximately 2,435 million gallons of additional flooding that we would have to manage as communities, as critical infrastructure owners, as residents, and as people who live and use and work in the watershed. So remember the 1,085 football fields that are likely to be flooded? Now imagine those 1,085 football fields having approximately 5 feet of floodwaters, of deep floodwaters. That is how much additional flood volume that we would have to manage in a 10-year storm by 2070. And that translates very quickly to what would be impacted across the watershed. That would impact critical infrastructure facilities, but let's not also forget it would impact priority population and vulnerable population groups that live in the watershed. But just to point our discussion back, there are likely over 4,400 critical assets across the watershed that relate to community health centers, for example, elder care facilities, our emergency operations centers, fire, police. It also relates to our community resources, such as pharmacies, places of worship, schools, our wastewater infrastructure, our energy infrastructure, and the list goes on. When we look at the impacts of that 2070 10-year storm, as we were discussing in the past 2 slides, we are seeing that there are approximately 70 additional critical facilities in the watershed that are likely to be impacted from this 10-year storm by 2070. And we also see that some towns are likely to be seeing more impacts than others, perhaps such as our quick analysis showed that in Milton, we're seeing over 30. Among those 70 additional critical assets, 30 of those lie in the town of Milton. And that sort of depends on where the flooding is and how intense that flooding would be in the future and what the changes are. And this is where we do a quick recap. We kind of pivot a little bit to the solution mode. So last year, we identified tailored solutions from our work where we took a deeper dive to understand where different types of solutions might be most effective in the watershed. And we did an extensive effort to identify areas or catchments within our larger watershed that would benefit most from gray and green solutions. And this prioritization work revolved around scoring about 180 catchments across the watershed using a number of metrics, but there were 3 key questions that we were answering as part of identifying what would work where best. And those questions were, how severe is the flooding today? And where might it change in the future? The second aspect was how effectively can that flooding be addressed by using nature-based solutions and green infrastructure? And then third, and most importantly, how feasible is the implementation of these nature-based solutions in the different areas of the watershed? And then after this, NEPRA team presented all of these potential catchments, or the top 3 catchments, to each community, to each of your to each community, and those were attended by your municipal representatives. And that was presented in the context of providing of seeking input on the ranking that was done. And from that feedback, we were able to identify the top catchments to evaluate more site-specific green and gray strategies. And that is really where the crux of our focus has been, to identify where the solutions would be most effective, and where our limited resources in terms of time and money would be best spent on evaluating flood mitigation strategies. And I will let Jenny speak to about that for the areas that we have evaluated.
So you can see on this slide the top 6 areas that we identified throughout the watershed, as Indrani was talking about, to prioritize our efforts for flood mitigation. And this doesn't mean that there isn't value in working in other areas of the watershed. It doesn't mean that even this is necessarily the most flooded part of town, but these were the catchments that scored best with the system that we were working in, as Indrani was talking about, right? Thinking about that severity of flooding, thinking about how well we can implement nature-based solutions and how feasible is implementation. So what we've done in these catchments is we've looked at them with the communities and said, what can we do here to reduce flooding? What is meaningful? What are meaningful projects? And we're thinking about all sorts of factors. We're thinking about, where is contamination? We're staying away from that. We're thinking about habitat that we want to preserve. We're thinking about community projects. We're thinking about where there's extra space on roadways that's maybe not being used. So we've worked with all the towns to come up with projects for these areas, and we'll talk through a little bit more about that. And on the next slide, you can see there's a lot in this table. I do understand that. So this is the list of the 6 catchments that were considered a priority for sort of that deeper dive this year. And the column that says target, mitigation target, that is how much flood water, in volume, do we need to store between now and 2070 so that we don't make the 2-year 24-hour storm worse, right? So we're trying to say, let's just keep flooding as bad as it is. The next column, football fields, that's the football fields, how many football fields that area would need. And it's just assuming 1 foot of depth there. And then there's from the strategies we used last year, it's sort of like, how do you think about this practically? How much impervious cover would you have to reduce? Some of these catchments, I mean, 66, 65, that's a big percentage. And it's not just straight impervious cover. It's not just taking away houses and parking lots and driveways and roads. It's the effective reductions, right? So it's how much can we capture and treat and put back in the ground? The other alternatives are to store on pervious areas or store on impervious areas, which I'll talk about in the next slides. But you can kind of see the magnitudes here, and these were sort of the optimized strategies for these areas. So what does reducing impact effective cover, impervious cover look like? You could be putting in a rain garden. Some people call that a bioretention area. This is a practice that's used to basically capture, treat, infiltrate, and uptake stormwater where it falls. You can also do it as a bioswale, which is basically just like a long rain garden, if you will, perhaps along the road. Next slide. Can also put in permeable pavements. They can be in the form of bricks. They can be in the form of actual pavement. You can see the image in the middle from a US EPA publication where the image on the part on the left is just normal paving and the part on the right is permeable pavement where the water soaks right through, goes back into the ground. Or you can even take strategies where you have, grass and green spaces intermixed with paving. areas, and those can be great for like overflow parking. You can also create more storage in what we think of as pervious spaces from a modeling perspective, but what normal people would think of as parks, playing fields, open spaces, or even existing wetlands, right? So making it so that our parks and fields could flood when it rains, but then the rain goes away after about a day and you can use those fields to play on again. And also protecting or constructing wetlands or expanding wetland spaces that are natural. Those provide, wetlands provide such a significant flood benefit. We can store water in rain barrels at our own houses or large cisterns at industrial and commercial sites. And we can even put storage underground, as the image on the right shows. And we can combine all of this into green and gray. These two images are just examples of what we think of as green streets, or practices where on the surface you might see the plantings and the trees, and underground there might be storage, there might be tanks, there might be additional pipes that are holding water. Cannot emphasize enough the additional benefits of green infrastructure. I'm not going to read all of these, but I'm sure those of you on this meeting have heard this before. Green infrastructure does so much more than just address flooding, right? It improves water quality. It helps with our local temperatures in urbanized areas. We're dealing with habitat improvements, our space. We're creating a more desirable human environment in our built areas. So I just want to zoom in to an example catchment, right? So we talked about what are these strategies to reduce flooding and how do we employ them? We did this for those 6 priority areas. So I'm just zooming into one of those priority areas in Foxborough. As you all can see, Gillette Stadium is in the north part of this area. So it is a pretty developed area. It does have a pretty significant amount of impervious cover, 770 acres total, this area, and 240 of that are impervious. So it's over 30% impervious cover, right? So over 30% of roads and parking lots, et cetera. And we came up with some strategies, including bioswales, bioretention basins, permeable pavings, rain gardens, some green and subsurface chambers, tree box filters, and even some wetland restoration. And those, when you use some, I'll call it engineering theoretical magic, basically when you're estimating what you could do, it's possible to hold 18.2 million gallons of water with these practices and effectively reduce over 450 acres of that 770 total acres of the catchment. So it's quite a bit of area that we can treat, put back in the ground. And so we run this through the model. And the next slide, what you're going to see is how effective this suite of practices can be in reducing flooding. So this graph on the left is showing the total runoff volume in million gallons. And on the bottom, you're seeing 3 bars. Baseline, no action. That's kind of like our present day. 2070, no action. That's 2070, not doing anything to mitigate this flooding. And these practices, when we run them through the model, we're actually seeing, 16 million gallons of flood reduction. It's not quite the amount we estimated theoretically with our calculations. That was, 18, but the model is still showing quite a bit of benefit here. And we're reducing flooding below present day flooding with these practices. Now, in reality, I do want to note there would be quite a bit to actually employ these, right? You have to think about utility conflicts. You have to think about funding. Some of these were on private property. So not all of these are under the control of the municipality. There's a lot of factors to actual implementation, but theoretically, if we did all of this, we'd see a great benefit. And so what we find is if you what's the right word? Your goal is over the goal. If you work to over the goal, you can get to closer to your goal ultimately when you're thinking about actually building this.
So we also use the opportunity in this project to evaluate high-intensity short-duration storms, in addition to the storms that Jenny mentioned a few minutes in the previous slide. We looked at the storms such as the ones we experience now in the summer months, the cloudburst type storms, and the type of storm that wreaked havoc in July 2021 with what damaged the Norwood Hospital, for example. To understand the impacts of short duration storms, we evaluated this area in Westwood, which is about 890 acres, 270 of which are impervious, so approximately 30%, a third of it is impervious. It has about 3/10 of miles of streams and tributaries of the Neponset. And it's right at the intersection of I-95 and Route 1, just south of Dedham Village. It includes the Islington train station in Norwood on the Franklin line. And so some of the reasons why we selected this particular area or catchment was because it has really good GIS data for us to be able to evaluate what types of solutions may work best to mitigate the types of storms that we have seen, that we see in summer months. It also is an area which historically has been flood prone. And it also is an area where we saw a lot of promise when we did the analysis last year in terms of understanding what works best where. This particular catchment area showed that it could significantly reduce the impacts of flooding by looking at aggressive solutions that Jenny mentioned. And we also see a mix of land use patterns. It's a combination of wooded and developed areas, as well as we see a combination of land ownership type in terms of municipal and private. So it's important to remember that the storm that caused damage to the Norwood Hospital in July 2021 dropped approximately 6 inches of rain in 90 minutes. This rainfall led to widespread flooding, as you may remember, including, particularly in that case, the inundation of the hospital's basement, affecting its mechanical equipment, forcing evacuation of patients. And that was a more intense storm than a 100-year storm that we are likely, a 100-year 2-hour storm that we are likely to experience by 2070. So really sort of although what we are showing on this slide are the impacts of these future storms, it is important for us to understand that one of these extreme events could happen now, here and now, and we would have to have the ability in our communities to deal with that type of flooding, and what can we do to mitigate the impacts of that such that we are not necessarily having to manage that type of devastating flood impacts. So as a result of that, so it was really important for us to understand the impacts. And I'd like to just quickly mention, so the map here shows from left to right the impacts of a 2-hour storm, a 6-hour storm, and a 24-hour storm, all with a 100-year return period. And it was important for us to look at these. So what you see from here is an exacerbation of flood risks. You're going to see some new areas that are flooded in these types of storm events, in the shorter duration storm events, and some areas that see intensification of flooding in these types of storm events. And again, now we're going to talk about what types of solutions can mitigate these types of events so we don't see this havoc flooding.
So we've looked at a variety of strategies to reduce flooding in this catchment in particular, and we really did hone in on not just what we think of as nature-based solutions, but we also thought about traditional gray infrastructure solutions. And we looked at the catchment as a whole to start. So we did that nature-based solution screening, just as I spoke about for Foxborough. The same way here. We looked at, where can we put bioretention? Where can we put wetlands? Where can we create those swales, etc. But we also looked pretty aggressively at where can you put in subsurface storage and where can you create aggressive infiltration areas, and that could be subsurface or surface practices. And we looked at those sort of across the board, and mostly those are going along or under large paved areas. We also zoomed in, and one of the benefits of working in this area is we did develop sort of a a submodel, if you will, and we're able to look very specifically at where could we add catch basins, where could we change catch basins instead of them functioning the way they do now, where they take water and they put it, back into the piped system. What if they put the water into the ground? What would that do? One of the things we found is for adding catch basins and even infiltrating catch basins is they're great strategies for localized flooding, right? If you have a ponding on your street or a small problem kind of at an intersection, great opportunity. But on the whole, for the watershed and the catchment, they don't move the needle significantly to minimize flooding. But we did find that if you upsize drains, which means you're basically taking a pipe and making it bigger underground, though that practice can have quite a impact on localized flooding, and it can convey water away from where there is flooding faster, and it can help those that are experiencing flooding, in their yards, their neighborhoods, to move that water away. We also looked at, can you reroute drains? And that means, what if we change where the pipe goes completely? And that could even include adding pumping, but what if you move the water to a completely different place in your catchment? And that can also have a great benefit, although it's slightly more complicated than upsizing drains. So we ran all of this through the model, and what we found is, and what this is another bar chart. You're seeing, on the left, right? This is all in million gallons, so we're talking in volumes. The baseline to your storm in Westwood would be expected to be, for a 2-year storm, almost 25 million gallons of volume. And in 2070, it's going to increase by almost 11 million gallons. If we employed the green, we would reduce that by almost 2 million gallons for this catchment. If we employ the gray alone, we don't reduce almost 6 million gallons. And together we're at almost 8 million gallons. We didn't quite get to our baseline in this instance, unlike Foxborough, but that's okay. That's why you iterate on these practices and projects and work together with communities and constituents and stakeholders to think through, how do we do this meaningfully in a way that actually can be achievable? So to summarize our takeaways, flooding is predicted to worsen in the future. Where and when it floods does depend on where you live in the Neponset River watershed. There are many actions we can all take to reduce flooding. And you've heard this from not just us, Indrani and I, but from the whole team tonight, right? It's about collaboration. It's about building consensus. It's about having appropriate representation. It's about creating equity in the process and prioritizing actions. And we all acknowledge that significant flood reduction is going to require changes to be made in communities and with partnerships with the state, with private entities. Ultimately, strategy, really solving flooding is not just structural, right? It's green and gray infrastructure, but it's policy, it's flood proofing, it's retreat. And together that sort of suite is where you get to mitigation. And with that, we'll be happy to take any questions.
I do see one. Thank you, Steve Olenoff. We need public support for this project to succeed. In order to get public support, we need public education of the need and the possible actions and solutions. How do we carry out this public education process? How do we finance this public education process? Great question. Thank you, Steve.
Sure.
Who wants to take that one on?
I think this is going to be a combination answer from the team, because it's not just us as, engineers and outreach folks, right? Everyone's thinking about this different ways. Indrani, do you want to start?
Yeah, I was gonna, it's a really great question. I agree, Jenny. And I think it's really an all hands approach, all hands on the deck approach. You heard a lot from NEPRA and MAPC on the types of effective community engagement, public education and outreach that has already happened throughout the duration of this project. And there is definitely more opportunities to do that. So we are doing, through the duration of this project, we've done more on the ground engagement, and there's definitely more opportunities to do that in the upcoming phases. The collaborative that MAPC and NEPRA have developed and spoken about as part of this project is just sort of the start of it. There have already been past efforts that have occurred in the watershed. Want to recognize and acknowledge that this is not the first time that we've started talking about it. But I think the formation of the collaborative, the opportunities that the flood model has provided has certainly been an effective tool for public education and outreach, is how sort of we as engineers and practitioners see the value of this work being, you have a visual aid, you can look at where your critical facilities are, what can be impacted, and then that sort of moves the needle in terms of what can we do to mitigate those solutions. And then let's not forget about the vulnerable population groups that live in our watershed that would need to be protected. So I think it's really a start of that conversation, and I'd like others on the team to weigh in as well.
I'll just echo everything that Indrani and Jenny were just sharing. Definitely it's all hands on deck. And I think that's why part of it is the work plan. I think a lot of what Jenny and Indrani just present also align with some of the priorities actions that we see in the plan. And so, we've created some detailed implementation steps. And so in the upcoming years, hopefully there's going to be continued active participation from municipal staff, outreach and engagement, and get more buy-in and feedback from the communities too, in terms of how we can all be part of the implementation effort. How do we finance this public education process? I think there are, it's an interesting funding landscape right now, but I think I'm grateful to be in Massachusetts with I think our leadership, the thought leaders are still very much committed to climate action plannings, and there are various funding sources from the MVP planning and action grants, other EEA grants. Recently, there was one on, drought resilience and water conservation grant, pilot grant, for example. So there are a few, and I'm feeling confident right now that there will be more support from, at least from the state, and to be creative, in terms of finding the fundings to support both the educational process, but also the implementation of these projects as well.
Excellent. Anyone else have any thoughts they want to add from the project team?
This is Ian Cook. I was just going to compliment Steve on getting right to the heart of the question. We are actually doing a lot of public outreach work already, but we're talking about needing pretty significant societal changes here, and that is going to be a big lift for everybody, both at the local level, the state level, and ultimately the federal level. So we're looking forward to working on that over the next few years, and welcome anybody and everybody's help in that process, because it won't get done unless everybody pitches in.
Excellent. Thank you. The next question is, you asked about getting the word out about this plan. Do you have a current communication plan that you can share? And I'm wondering if Carrie might want to pick up on this one.
Sure. I don't think we've got a formal written out plan, but we have been trying through our community engagement to figure out the best way to get the word out. And we have written this into our application for our phase 3 grant, which I'm really hoping comes through. so that we can make sure that we're reaching not only the residents and businesses that are going to be most affected by these climate impacts, but also decision makers, and making sure we're, really trying to facilitate getting residents and businesses together with their decision makers to talk these things through.
Excellent. Thank you, Carrie. And I will mention that project updates and all kinds of links to the flood model, to project updates, to recordings of our meetings are on our website. So some really great resources there that you can take advantage of as we speak. It's probably time consuming, but well worth it as we feel the funds go to prepare and to create these resources for community. So definitely take that in. I think Ian may have answered Heather's question. Do you want to just point out where the flood model is available so people can check out their own neighborhoods?
Sure. If folks just want to go to our website, you can sort of find it through the navigation on the website. Or if you can remember a URL, just go to neponset.org/watershed-flood-model. It's almost memorable.
Excellent. Thank you. Are there actions that you can focus homeowners like me to take on our individual properties that would help provide risk mitigation for flooding in the watershed overall? Great question. That's from an anonymous attendee.
Yeah, I'll be happy to start, and I know folks can join in if I miss anything. So there are some things you can do that really do help the watershed. Some examples include getting rain barrels so that you can attach your gutters to go into a storage tank, so you don't necessarily get all the water when it rains going out onto your driveway and onto the road. You can also redirect your downspouts to go to grassed areas, or put them into like a cistern underground. Like one of my house has one of the rain spouts in the backyard, goes down through a pipe underground and then goes into basically a storage tank underground, and it gets goes back right into the ground. And those aren't necessarily significantly expensive projects. You could also do permeable pavement strategies on your driveways. I actually have permeable pavers. That's not a cheap project, I'll say that. But that is a way to, keep rainwater from getting from your property onto the road, and every little bit helps. So those are some ideas. There's certainly a lot of resources online if you Google, what can I do on my property to reduce stormwater runoff? And there's lots of guidance in Massachusetts for homeowner strategies. So I hope that helps answer the question.
That is helpful, Jenny. Thank you. Yes, there's also some information on NEPR's website about building rain gardens and how you go about doing that on your own property, and what kinds of plants are really good absorbers and have roots that take in water and mitigate some of that risk on your own property. So that's also a great strategy, and it looks pretty. But yeah, rain barrels are also a great option as well.
Appreciate that, Grace. I always think like an engineer.
No problem. That's why it takes all of us, right? That's why we're at
Plants
it
are
all
such
together.
an important piece of the
Yeah.
puzzle. Plants do uptake, and trees in
Trees, yeah.
You want to note, trees in particular take up so much more rainwater than you would expect. We were working with a resident who had accidentally lost a tree in the backyard due to a storm, and they had basement flooding afterwards. And it's because the tree came down, and there was so much more water in the area because the tree had been uptaking it. So it's very impactful, and we don't realize.
Excellent. Yes.
And I just want to note in the written Q&A, I added a web link to the part of the project website that will be populated with some of these suggestions.
Excellent. Thank you. Will there be an executive summary issued that brings together all these findings? I see a large part of these proposed solutions coming from the regulation front, such as zoning, planning boards, and regulations, and having a guiding document in front of these local boards would be most helpful. Thank you, from Joe Greeley.
I can jump in here. That's an excellent question, Joe. We will have a couple of documents. So we will have the actual work plan that will be published on the website, but also we're hoping to do some technical assistance to really get together with town boards who want to make some of these changes to help them do that so that they're not working from scratch. We have already compiled some technical assistance with some ideas, but we really want to make sure that towns aren't feeling like they're on their own and have the help and expertise of people like MAPC, you know, who have experience in policy updates. So that that will be available, and we will be linking to other resources that that exist as well to help people in the meantime. I hope that answers the question.
Carrie, I will just add that also as part of the earlier phases of this project, we have evaluated some of the stormwater policies and the efficacy of those policies in terms of flood reduction and how some of those policies would need to consider these future storm events and what we can do to mitigate that such that, and from that, we have seen that collective action and collective implementation of more stringent flood resilient stormwater policies and regulations can really help in moving the dial towards mitigating flood impacts in our communities.
Great. Thank you both. Question from Kenneth Elevitz. What is the pump? I don't have one yet, and relying on gravity drainage is painfully slow.
We were just having some back and forth on how to deal with a rain barrel if you have one and want to make sure it's, you know, utilized. So I just, yeah, Kenneth had asked about what do you do to use your rain barrel, and I had explained. So I have a pump on mine. I try to use it to garden and wash my car, or just drain it down when it's drier outside and try to keep it empty after storms. The pump is just a small submersible wet, you know, like wet pump. I don't know how to explain it. It's really little. Like it's just this little box that pumps with a small pipe. Got it at a garden store, honestly. And I just stick it in and use it when I need it. So it's not like a whole setup. It's just I can just use it. So it's a great way to use that water and not just gravity drain. Not like a sump pump quite, it's smaller than that actually, but little, like I would call it like submersible garden type pipe pump. Hope that's helpful to folks.
Excellent. All right. Well, it looks like we're drying up on questions. I will.
Karen?
Yes.
Can I just point out there was an interesting question that got answered in writing, but might be worth discussing. That's actually in the answered section. Would it be useful if I were to read it? I know it's a little tricky to get switched
No,
over.
absolutely.
It says, this is a national, international problem. Has any other watershed done this? It would help to convince watershed residents knowing they are not being asked to be pioneers and that there are proven solutions. So are we completely reinventing the wheel here, team, or is this happening in other places too?
It was answered in the chat very effectively by Anna. This is a model that has been, or the approach that we're using in the Neponset River watershed has also been developed for the Charles River. The Charles River Watershed Association is leading a very similar effort such as this one in terms of understanding how we look at flood impacts strategically at the watershed scale and then dive into at the local scale. So think regionally, but act locally. And that has been really proven to see a lot of effective flood reduction projects that are breaking ground in adjacent watershed. We have also seen a very similar approach being taken in the Mystic River watershed. So even within Massachusetts, there are certainly good precedent examples of how this can be, or this is more effectively addressed if we look at the watershed scale, since flooding really knows no jurisdictional boundaries, and hence the solutions that we need to come up with. We need to think outside the box. We need to think more regionally, but we also would need to implement those projects in our local cities and towns and communities.
And I think this is more of a coastal example, Andrani, but I do love mentioning Charleston, South Carolina, and the Dutch dialogues process. And that's such an innovative way to be thinking about, we've learned from that process and brought it to Massachusetts. And if folks are interested in kind of learning something new about a different region, you can look up the Dutch dialogues. Again, more of a coastal flood situation, but it's still, a process to undertake.
Very good. Thank you. I have learned a great deal myself at this very helpful meeting. So Carrie, I'll pass it over to you to wind us up and send us on our way.
Sure, thank you. So, final thoughts. We are wrapping up this phase of the project, but we are really hoping to continue this. We've applied for additional grant funding to continue working with all of the cities and towns in the watershed. And we would love to know how you would like to be involved. And also what would you like to see your city or town do? So we want you to keep in touch with us. You can feel free to enter any thoughts you have right now into the Q&A. But I would really encourage you to sign up for our mailing list. This QR code will get you there, as well as the web address, the URL there. And you can sign up for, for project-specific updates. We also maintain that website with project updates, including the flood model and the viewer, the story map about how that model was developed, all of the great things that we're doing out in the community, and the work plan will all be there. But we really want to make sure, as we were talking about earlier, that we are reaching people, that we're activating people. This work can't be done without you. Your cities and towns need your support to get this work done. And we need to make sure that the projects that are identified and advanced take your needs into consideration as well. And we'd really like to facilitate that. So those are my final thoughts.
Well, thank you for being with us. We appreciate your time and your attention to this important work that we have going, and we look forward to ways of you continuing along the path with us in the future. So thank you very much. Enjoy summer.
Thanks, everyone.
Mhm.